Bienvenidos a Puentes and Possibilities, a podcast for educators, school leaders, and industry experts working to close the STEM workforce gap. My name is Coral Zayas. I'm the author of Teaching K-5 Science, Encouraging Exploration, Inquiry, and Problem Solving. My book launches on April 7th, and each week from now until the book launch, I'd love to invite you to join me for some sneak peeks into each chapter of my book, as well as a chance for you to hear from some very special guests who will be joining me to dive deeper into some of the major themes explored throughout the book. Welcome to Season 1, The Explorers. Over the next 8 episodes, I'll be inviting fellow teachers, instructional coaches, industry innovators, and fellow authors to the podcast. Each guest is intentional, as they're joining in on the conversation to share their wisdom and expertise on specific topics explored in the book. I'm a firm believer in the power of community and a professional learning network. I've learned from many others along the way to get to where I am today. So these conversations are a chance for all of us to continue growing and learning and better able to serve our students in exploring the beautiful world of elementary science. Each episode is going to explore the themes of the new book. Welcome to episode 3, part 2. Today we're taking a sneak peek into chapter 3. All means all. Strategies to support all learners in science. Chapter 3 is one of my favorites to write. It's unique in that it provides a space for educators to learn strategies to support the growing number of multilingual learners and neurodiverse learners across our country. Inclusive teaching practices that support all learners, like the Universal Design for Learning, UDL. While these student populations can look different based on the state and even the cities that we live in, the latest numbers from the National Center for Education Statistics lists that just over 5 million multilingual students are across our country, making up about 10% of the total U.S. student population. That number can vary greatly state by state, with states like my home state of Texas having more than 20% of our student population being multilingual. While an accurate number of neurodiverse learners across the country can be a bit harder to calculate, we know that an estimated 7.5 million students, about 15% of our country's student population, currently qualify for special education services. We'll deep dive into this today. It's my pleasure to introduce you to my next guest. Emily Morris has a Master's of Arts, a Master's of Education, and is a licensed professional counselor, author, and podcast host with a passion for neurodiversity. Inspired by her own neurodivergent journey, she has authored several books related to supporting neurodivergent people and hosts the Neurodiversity podcast. Emily provides professional development worldwide, with many of her resources available on the Neurodiversity University online platform. She's based in St. Louis, Missouri. She specializes in mental health support for neurodivergent individuals and their families. As a seasoned speaker, she regularly addresses conferences on fostering neurodiversity-affirming workplaces, making her a key resource for businesses seeking to promote inclusivity. Emily, thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you so much for having me.
So over the next 15 to 20 minutes, we're going to have a conversation with about 5 questions surrounding supporting neurodivergent learners in the classroom across the country. Are you ready to dive in?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right. Here's your first question. Share a little bit about your background in education and counseling and what led you to write your 4 books.
Yeah. So, it's interesting. I think for a lot of people, we go into education often for reasons that are very personal because it is such a profession that really involves kind of showing up as you are and kind of having that connection with the work that you're doing. So I went into education really because when I was growing up, school was really difficult. So I actually ended up graduating. I'm distracted. This is what my point that I'm trying to get at. So I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was a kid. And it's one of those things that when you're diagnosed with ADHD, like at the time I was, which was back in the early 90s, that was something that was really pretty rare for girls, especially at that time. But I was also in a gifted ed program. So I was twice exceptional. So that's a term, if anyone's unfamiliar, that refers to somebody who is both cognitively gifted and has another diagnosis layered on top of that, like giftedness and ADHD or autism or dyslexia. And so school was just really tricky for me. So I ended up feeling really frustrated a lot of the time, like understanding that there was kind of this big gap between what I was able to do, what I was doing, and then how I felt like I should be able to do, how I should show up in those spaces. So I decided to go into education because I wanted to really help kids who were like me, who kind of learn and think differently, who communicate in different ways, and who need different types of supports. Because the supports that I got I didn't really get a whole lot of supports. I got a lot of discipline, right? Like, you did this, now here's this consequence, and you're going to learn from that mistake. But it just didn't really work that way. So I went into education. I taught in the gen ed classroom. I got my first master's in gifted education, and I taught for over a decade in both elementary and middle school gifted ed programs. But what I really loved about that work was that social and emotional side of things, where I, just helping kids with those other things that are going on, especially if they are also twice exceptional. So I got a second master's in counseling. And so I worked for a while as a school counselor before I transitioned. And I'm now a licensed professional counselor. So I provide therapeutic services to neurodivergent kids, teens and their families. And that work has been thoroughly rewarding. I really love it. But that's also what led me to starting the podcast, the Neurodiversity podcast. And also writing the book. So my first book is Teaching Twice Exceptional Learners in Today's Classroom, where I talk about how to support those 2E kids. My most recent book is Neurodiversity-Affirming Schools, Transforming Practices so all students feel accepted and supported. And I wrote that with my co-author, Amanda Morin. And then I have 2 parenting books as well that I've authored. And so, but really, like, it was a lot about those experiences that I had, but also the discomfort I had as an educator when I was in the classrooms and feeling like the way things that we're doing, that things have always been done, just aren't really working. And so really wanting to find different ways to support students. And so it's been a great opportunity to kind of move toward that goal and help educators, professionals, parents kind of understand how to support kids.
And I'm so glad that you bring that up, Emily, because, for example, I was in a gifted program growing up. I didn't get diagnosed with ADHD until less than 3 years ago. But this is something that's been going on the entirety of my school career. And it's really similar to what you said. It was like, for me, it wasn't the discipline piece. I was silent. I never asked a question. I just listened. I took it in. I did my work. It was easy until tests came around. And then didn't matter what test I took, it was never working out. Like, I couldn't show my knowledge in that way. But I think that now we've moved a lot further in understanding that we do have students that are twice exceptional. Like, they may be in a gifted program, but they may not have even been identified yet as qualifying for a 504 or an IEP. So I think the work that you do is so incredibly important, because even though we've made progress, we still have a lot of progress to be made in our schools to really support our learners. So thank you for the work that you do.
Yeah, absolutely.
So here's my next question for you. So you answered it a little bit. Let's see if there's anything else you'd like to add. Tell us a little bit about your work supporting teachers and schools to create those neurodiverse affirming spaces.
Yeah. I've been lucky enough to have the opportunity to go in and work with schools, provide in-service and professional development training, because I know that schools are just really hungry for this information. You mentioned it, where there are a lot of kids who are neurodivergent who haven't been identified. There's a lot of reasons that they might not be identified. So much of it is due to just stigma surrounding a lot of these diagnoses. So much of it is about access. So much of it is about cultural capital, as far as like recognizing like how to even go about getting a diagnosis. And many of these students, there may be students who are struggling significantly enough that the school really is noticing them. But a lot of these kids maybe aren't significantly impacted as far as their education and academics go. So they kind of fly under the radar, but they often need supports. They might be identified later on when they're older, so like late elementary school, middle school, high school, but recognizing for educators, there are tools and strategies we can do that we can put into place in our classrooms and in our schools that help learners really understand what's happening, what they need to do, and then to ultimately be successful with that. So I think when I consider this, sometimes teachers get really overwhelmed, and we're talking about like how to do things. First of all, it doesn't have to be, don't make it harder than what it is. Even little changes can make a big difference. But the bottom line is practices that are good for neurodivergent kids are good for all kids. So when we put these systems in place, we are making a more accessible space for everybody. So that's really the approach that I take. Like, what are the small things that we can do? How can we understand these different neurotypes and the traits that might be popping up so that we can move away from seeing some of these traits as kind of how society often sees them, which is like character flaws. Like if somebody is very direct in their communication, that is often interpreted as being rude when maybe that's not the intent at all. If somebody is distracted and has a hard time getting their work turned in, we say that they're lazy or they're unmotivated when really maybe that's an executive functioning skill that we need to support. And so when we approach it in this way, not only are we able to help kids just learn the content, but we're also able to help them approach life in a way that will help them be successful in the long run, where we're helping them solve those problems and being really explicit about what tools might work for them so that they're not just trying to like figure it out as they go, or they get to adulthood and they've graduated and they don't, all of a sudden the wheels come off because nobody's ever really given them the tools that they need to be successful.
Yeah, and I think that's also super important because even though like this particular book is geared towards an elementary audience, right? Like I always think about the pathway because I started in
Hmm.
that high school to college piece, that connection. And I think I don't think I know because I've seen it and I've experienced it like that cut off between shifting from high school to a college environment or a college to work environment. You have had a somewhat of a system in place, even if it wasn't perfect for you, you learn to work within that system. And all of a
Hmm.
sudden that system's not there. And how do you navigate moving forward? Right.
Right. Yeah,
So
especially if you did okay academically. If it didn't come to the surface, then that was something that probably masked what those struggles might have been. So, yeah, and it's also interesting to think about like what are the messages that people internalize about themselves as they are students, as they're going through school, and how does that carry forward with them?
yeah, I couldn't agree more. Can you talk a little bit more about that school family partnership and collaboration? Because sometimes we're getting diagnoses at home. Sometimes it's a teacher that's noticing, I think the student needs to be tested. How can schools support families and families support schools so that we can all create affirming learning environments for our students?
Yeah, I think, well, maybe to start with, it's good for educators, especially to recognize that neurodivergent kids may have neurodivergent parents. And so I think sometimes we miss that component of things, that sometimes even the way we're communicating with parents, the way we're asking parents to engage with the school communities, there are things that we could do to make even those processes more efficient and effective for neurodivergent adults as well. The other part is just about helping bring parents into the process and helping them understand, like, specifically, how can you support your kids if your child does need accommodations? How do you help them get those? I find that, and when I worked as a school counselor, especially, and even since then, since I've been out of the schools, I sat through a lot of IEP and 504 meetings. And the mistake that I see educators making over and over again as parents are sitting there is that we get caught up in our own world and start using jargon and terminology. And the parents are not even really aware of like what all of those things mean, or they don't know what questions to ask. So how can we make sure that we're really giving parents all of the information, that we're really walking them through, that we're really helping them advocate for their child in a way that's effective, and also so that they feel like they're heard, because then in the future we want them to come back to us. We want to have that collaborative approach. So those are some of the things that I often think about. I think another thing that we could do better in the schools sometimes is if we have a student who's struggling. Maybe they have a formalized plan of some type, maybe they don't. But parents might have some really creative approaches for how to support kids. And I feel like sometimes teachers or administrators feel a little overwhelmed and feel like they can't attempt those things because they've never done them before, or they don't know really what it would mean, or how that would look. But sometimes we can just try some things. We can just have the opportunity to really think through, like, what might this look like? Can we just give it a shot? And then if it's helpful for that student, then that's a win. We don't have to be bound by specifically what accommodations we've used in the past. We don't ever want a plan to be boilerplate. We want it to be unique for each individual child.
That's fantastic advice. Thank you for sharing that, Emily. My next question revolves around how can educators potentially like best identify if a student is twice exceptional? Because I think a lot of times we might catch one and we're not catching the other piece of it. What should teachers be looking out for? How can we support them if they're kind of curious, like maybe we're missing something. How can I better support the student? Because I do think that twice exceptional tends to be a newer term that not teachers are fully understanding like what it all entails. Could you speak a little more to that?
It's interesting, and this varies so much from state to state and district to district, specifically about how you identify gifted learners and how you provide services for them. I think something to recognize when I go and work with educators, quite often, people, especially who've been in the field of gifted education for a long time, will make statements about how it feels like the students that they're working with now are different than the students they were working with in the past. And I agree with them. One of the things that the gifted education world has really been grappling with quite a bit is the racial disparity and disparity for culturally and linguistically diverse learners that we see, where for a long time they were not getting identified, partially because of teacher bias, partially, for a lot of lots of other factors. But one of the things that the gifted ed world has done to try to mitigate that impact is by implementing best practices of universal screening, meaning that you're going to test every student to identify some of those gifted learners. You're not relying on teacher nominations, teachers saying, "Oh, this kid's really smart," because honestly, teachers tend to suggest the kids who are highly verbal and compliant. Like that's just who they identify. And so through universal screening, in addition to minimizing that equity gap for our culturally and linguistically diverse learners, we are also finding a lot of students who are twice exceptional, who maybe wouldn't have been identified in the past because they don't have those traits that the teachers would necessarily nominate them for to be assessed. And so, it's interesting. The research really shows that when somebody is either identified as gifted or they are placed, for special education services, a lot of times they're never really assessed or placed for the opposite. Like there's not a whole lot of overlap there, which is a disservice for a lot of our kids. Recognizing that those things can coexist is really important. It's tricky because some districts for gifted education services rely not only on cognitive scores, so like an IQ test, but they might also rely on achievement scores in reading and math to identify services for academics. But you can be twice exceptional. You can be gifted and dyslexic, and you might actually be able to perform very well and be cognitively challenged in a class that might even involve a lot of reading and writing if you have some accommodations to do so, because it's not about the content. It's about how you are receiving and then expressing that information. But I know a lot of teachers, and again, thinking forward to when kids get a little bit older, especially in like honors or pre-honors classes or AP classes, there's this idea that no, you have to be able to do the content the way it's written. They have to be able to do this. But ultimately, that's actually not true. Like if you have a student who wants to use an audiobook, whether they are ear reading or eye reading, it doesn't really make a lot of difference if you're looking at comprehension there. And so how do we make that accessible for kids? What really it also kind of gets into is some of the ideas about universal design, just as far as making sure that students have accessibility for all of these different factors. So anyway, areas where we might see twice exceptional kids have some different gaps as far as their abilities and performance, like cognitive ability, like they often have very high verbal ability, abstract reasoning, problems like problem solving, like categorizing and like identifying patterns, those types of things. Those are often areas that we see that show up more in the academic realm, but areas where you might have difficulties that you might see: executive functioning, emotional regulation, social connection and communication. Like those are the things that often come to the surface that need some other supports, which is sometimes confusing when you have a child who seems very bright, but then those other things that seem like quote unquote common sense don't come as naturally to them.
Yeah. I love that you added that. I think that's so important. A lot of us lately who have had some of these conversations, I have a lot of friends who are late diagnosed, like me,
Mm-hmm.
like an ADHD and some other things. And we talk about those pieces. And so I think it's important that you highlighted that. Thank you
Mm-hmm.
for that, Emily. So I know that you personally provide a wide range of community spaces and supports for both educators, families, schools to continue learning and implementing and creating systems that work for all of our students. Can you talk about a little bit of the offerings and the spaces that you provide if others would like to learn more?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a lot of things going on, and so sometimes it's a great opportunity to connect. So I think maybe the first thing that I'll mention is we have this platform called Neurodiversity University, which basically is an online learning platform. It's primarily for professionals. So two of the things we have there, one is called the Educator Hub, the other is the Therapist Hub. But there's opportunities for webinars and trainings, community support, lots of different things in both of those places. In the Therapist Hub, that specifically is for mental health clinicians, psychologists, counselors, social workers who work with neurodivergent individuals. And we offer live continuing education training that is approved through the American Psychological Association. So that's really exciting. We also just have courses that are available. And again, most of those courses do have an educational slant to them. However, they also have a lot of parents who like to complete those courses and trainings simply because it gives them tools as far as advocacy and understanding their own child from that academic perspective. So, yeah, those are a few of the things. We've got a Facebook group, the Neurodiversity Podcast Advocacy and Support Group, if anyone wants to join us there, but lots of places to connect and just find community, which I think is really important.
I couldn't agree with you more, Emily. I think that the community piece is critical for all of us to not just survive in this field, but to thrive in this field and be able to
Mhm.
support ourselves as growing professionals and our students every day in our classrooms. So I want to say thank you again for your willingness to be here with me today. I'm so excited to have a fellow author on the podcast, especially one from our same publisher. And I've been able to learn from your work. I'm so grateful for you to be here today. So thank you again. And I look forward to continuing to watch the incredible things that you put out into
Oh,
our education world.
thank
Thank
you so much. No, thanks for having me.